poke around inside of routing. Routing is a fundamental aspect of ASP.NET MVC that a lot of people initially dismiss as URL rewriting. And this is a really, really important point. Because we've all done URL rewriting at some point. We want to change a URL. The request comes in from the browser, and it's like, /foo, and you want to say, no, if it matches this regex, go over here. Well, that's a one-way thing. That is rewriting a URL in progress. But the routing table and the routing concepts in MVC and in ASP.NET 3.5 SP1 are declarations of what routes should look like, and they are two-way. So that means not only can I express a route, but I can ask, give me a URL for this thing I'm trying to accomplish. I could say, in a world where I were going to call dinner details, how would that URL look? It's kind of a hard concept until you actually see it. So I'm just going to go here and say routes.map_route, and I'm going to name it. So I'm actually doing a named route, and this route is named so that I can be specific. I can actually request a route by name as opposed to saying figure it out. I'm going to say I want a pretty details route. And all this route is going to have, instead of controller, action, and ID, is it's just going to have ID. Okay, and that's assuming from the root. And then when that route, I was in Australia a little while back. Apparently, root is a horrible word there, and you can offend someone. And someone told one of the coders who was on stage that, yeah, dude, don't say root oh, it's bad. Don't. And then he couldn't get that out of his head, so he spent the entire talk going, rooting, oh, God, rooting, ah, root. And then there's just the giggling sound of the Australians. Okay, so what we're saying here, let's see if I'm allowed to step down. This is our default route, controller, action, and ID. And that's a really good generic route because you've got a foo controller and a bar action. You automatically are able to address that by going /foo/bar. And you're often pulling stuff out of a system by ID, so they just put ID in there by default. Now, the important thing about routes as it relates to URLs is that that right-hand side can be removed, right? So I could say /dinners. I could say /dinners/index. I could say /dinners/index/1. But I could chop off each bit. So you need this default section here that's saying if anything's missing, this is what you want to replace it with. So what I'm saying here is I just have ID. I'm not going to get controller or action. So by default, the controller is going to be dinners, and the action is going to be details. So otherwise, it wouldn't know where to route that to. But the problem with that, though, is I'm asking for a URL that's going to be right there at the top. It's already kind of reserved for /dinners or /accounts or /whatever. I need to make sure that it doesn't accidentally try to turn my number, my ID, which is an integer, into a string. So I give it a constraint. That second line there is a constraint. So here I'm saying it's going to be one or more digits. And that's how that works. Phil, what would happen if I removed that? I'm asking you, Phil, seriously, it's interactive. Let's find out. Bad things will happen. Crazy stuff. I probably should have told a joke right then. Right? Dinner not found. Got confused. It tried to, I don't know what it did. Who knows, man? But let's go and add that and recompile. How many Microsoft PMs does it take to put in a light bulb? Let me take that feedback to the team and I'll get back to you. Right, so there you go. So by giving it a constraint, you're able to route that appropriately. And this is really important because you'll find that as your routing tables get more and more and more sophisticated, you're going to find that you will initially write what they call greedy routes, routes that will match stuff that you really don't want to match. You might say, oh yeah, I want blog post /month/day. But if you don't go and say that month is 1 or 2 digits, then you could find other routes that will match to that if 5 or 6 digits show up. So you want to make sure that your route describes the least amount of information that can be expressed. And that way it won't interfere with other ones. And then there's route debuggers. I think Phil's got some information at his blog, and Stephen Walter have got both route debuggers that when you have a route with 15, 20 different things, it can be complicated. So you're going to want to write tests to test those routes and make sure that you're not getting the wrong information passed on to your system. Now, I named that route so we could potentially ask for it by name elsewhere. I could go and say route URL and say route URL slash route URL and ask for it by name. Let me see here. How did this work? Here's my list where I've got Geek Out. By default, it changed the URL. And this is a really amazing thing that I didn't go and change that view. I didn't hard code anywhere that I wanted it to be dinner/details. It just knew when it was listing these out that would work. Let's find out why. Dinners. Index. Two cannibals are eating a clown. One cannibal says the other cannibal. Does this taste funny? HTML action link on line 18 says, I'm going to have a title of a dinner, and I want to link that to the details page. Not the details page, excuse me, the details action. See, this is the thing. I'm an old school web forms guy. So I'm still getting used to this. But the point is that we're not saying we're linking to a page. We're linking to an action. I've been doing this for 18 months, and I still make that mistake. Because one of the things that web forms people often make mistakes, junior web forms folks, is like they'll hit like localhost/trace.axd, right? And they'll go, okay, well, where's that file on disk? And then you go hunting around. We've all done that before, where we've been doing some work in HTTP handlers. We go and we hit a handler. Okay, where's that? Oh, it's not on disk. It doesn't exist. Because instinctively we have this sense that what's in the URL represents what's on disk. Okay? And in web forms, that's not true, but it's usually true. Right? foo.aspx usually means there's a foo.aspx on disk. So I think about URL and page. In MVC, that's been completely removed because we've got this concept of a controller that's going to be created and a method's going to be called. And there's a relationship between that controller and its method and what's going on in the URL. Somebody says /dinner/details/1. We're going to go and make a new dinner controller, call the details method, and pass in the index. But now I've changed this route, and I've made it so I can say dinner/1. And all of my links in my application automatically got updated because I was never referring to pages and URLs. I didn't hard code, although I could have, /dinner/details/1 here. I used an HTML helper, and I said, I want an action link. Link me to the details action. And there's lots and lots of overloads that you can use, and there's also things like url.route URL. And these are all ways for you to request from the routing tables, give me a URL that will accomplish this thing that I want to do. So I'm actually saying, give me a URL that will get me to the details method, passing this in. So you can change the entire structure of your application and how it is addressed from a URL perspective if you follow those rules. And you'll find yourself in trouble, as I have, when I have hard-coded URLs and then messed around with my routes. That's a really big mental leap I have found for a lot of folks in starting out in MVC. And if you're an old-time MVC person, you've probably found the same thing. So let's go back to the home page, and let's get this map, get some kind of a map over here. So I've made a couple of scripts. These are all here's some scripts that come with MVC. Let me zoom in here. So by default, you get jQuery. I've got the minimized version of jQuery here, and then the VS-Doc. The VS-Doc is that documentation that's going to give you the IntelliSense for jQuery. And that comes in. And I've got MS Ajax, and then it's the MVC extension for Ajax. Then I just made this nerd-dinner.js. So that's the only JS file that I've gone and added at this point. So I'm just going to call load map. And this is a virtual Earth thing. I didn't know anything about virtual Earth, but Dave Ward and I, and Koja.com, Dave Ward and I sat down and we figured out the Earth SDK. Basically, you include this one line of JavaScript for virtual Earth, and then you get this VE map namespace and object, and you can start messing around. So we have this div for Nerd Dinner, and I'm going to say make a new map, turn off bird's eye, set the dashboard size to being small, and then if you have a latitude and longitude, which we don't yet, go ahead and set that, and then call load map. So this is all not MVC specific. This is, hey, I wanted a JavaScript library. How do I do it? Back over here, I've just got this map, div the map, and I gave it a size, and I probably should have styled it a little differently. Down at the bottom here, we're going to go and say document.ready, and I'm going to make a function. This function is a way of saying I want to have this called when the document is finished loading, and we'll say nerddinner dot load map. Are the brackets wrong? Yeah, I just do that. Thanks. People who can read JavaScript are weird people. Because it's like, someone in the speaker room earlier was, someone said something like, yeah, I couldn't get such. Oh, yeah, well, that's a display colon, none, float left, and then you need to use the box map and the thing with the hack. And it was just like, it was like when you meet a random white guy who speaks Chinese, you know? It's just like, wow, that is amazing. I just wanted to stare. But, you know, he was just going CSS. He was talking CSS, and I wanted to just stare at him. You know, there's actually game shows in China and in Japan that are basically called White Guy Speaks Chinese. And they basically tell them riddles, and if they get it right, that shows that they really know the language. It's true. We should do that with CSS. Because from my point of view, it is a crazy-ass language. Okay, so all that was get some JavaScript, set up a div, and then I've got a map, right? So I need to get some dinners, and I need to maybe make an AJAX call, and maybe I'll find the most popular dinners, and I'm going to create a list on that right-hand side there. So we're going to be doing some AJAX. This is just jQuery here. I added a couple of things like when you click the search button and some different stuff. I'm still kind of learning jQuery, so I'm in no way an expert. But let me see here. Let's do this. This is step 2. Why don't we write a test rather than doing it the regular way? I've got a bunch of tests. If you go and hit run tests, let's run them and see how we're doing first. Dun, 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 test, green, boom. Hey, look at that. So by default right now, Nerd Dinner's got 94 tests. And I want to do something test-driven. So I'm not quite sure how I'm going to implement this yet. So yeah, to-do needs more tests. Let's make another test. People think that's silly, but I love typing in to-do. Test method, public void. Now the alt.net guys like really long method names. So get most popular dinners action with no limit returns expected dinners on Tuesday. Or what is today? Yeah, whatever. You get the idea. And I probably should have typed it a little better, but there's all the Diet Coke coursing through my veins. Typically, you want to do this pattern, the AAA pattern, which is arrange, act, and assert when you're doing tests. And MVC really lends itself to testing because the separation of concerns between what a controller does and his responsibility and what a view does and their responsibilities is very separate. So in this case here, I'm going to set up tests to describe how I want my controller to work, but it's important to note that this is test-driven, meaning I'm going to describe the way I want it to work, but it doesn't yet exist. So I'm testing something that does not yet exist, and in the hopes of it affecting the design. I know that I need a controller. So over here, I'm just going to say, and I've even made a function called create search controller that I'll show you in a second to do a little helper action. So arrange for me is just get a search controller. And this is important to note because remember earlier when I said you hit a URL and somebody makes the controller and somebody calls the method? Well, that somebody is Phil. He's inside your computer and he's doing those things because the system makes those decisions. The MVC engine is the thing that news up a controller, and the MVC engine is what calls that method. But when you're in a test, there's no IIS, there's no ASP.NET, there's no system to make a controller, and no one's going to call that unless you do. And that's kind of the beauty of it. And the controller doesn't know that he's not running in IIS. Have you ever tried to test web forms? If you ever try to do any kind of unit testing in web forms, you'll find it's very, very difficult because what does web forms expect? It expects that it's living inside of ASP.NET, that it has a context, that someone's passed in cookies and all that kind of stuff. MVC tries to avoid that at all costs. So we're going to be doing JSON, so I'm going to want to make sure that my controller returns JSON. I'm going to say controller dot and get most popular dinners. And I could pass in like a limit, like pass in like 10, but I'll say null for now. We'll make it nullable. And this is saying that it doesn't exist yet. Get most popular dinners we're going to write over in the search controller. And that's our action. We're taking action there. And then I'm going to assert a couple of things here. First, this probably needs to be a JSON result. Now, typically, we've been returning views. We say return view this, return view that. And that's saying to the system, go over and find that view, render the view, and return that HTML. But we're going to use a JSON result. All of these things derive from action result. These are all things that you can take action on. Now, this JSON result that I'm kind of envisioning that I'm going to return from this controller is going to sit inside of result.data. That right there should be a JSON result. So and I could, if I want, I could say is instance of type. And I'd say, well, this is the type I want to check, and I want to make sure that this is going to return a type of, it's going to be full of a list of JSON dinners. I could potentially assert the type of this JSON result, but it wouldn't have succeeded in this defensive cast if I didn't. I could say type of list of JSON dinner. And down here, let's say assert r equal, and I think there are 40 dinners on a database. I don't know. I expect 40. And let's see, dinners. I'm probably going to need to get those dinners out of here. So we'll say var dinners equals result.data. And I'm going to cast that after this assert to a list of dinners. The JSON result is going to package all that stuff up. So list of dinners and assert as equals dinners dot count. Okay? So I've said I'm going to go and call this method. I'm going to pass in null, which should give me all of the dinners. I'm going to make sure that I got back JSON dinners from my JSON result, and I should probably assert that the result isn't null too. And then I'm going to take that data inside of there, make sure it's a list of dinners, and then assert that there's 40 of them. So I'm not really making a JSON call, though, here. But I'm saying that I want that dinner controller to return, that search controller, rather, to return a thing of a type JSON result. And this is a really important thing. It takes a little while to get your head around. There's no browser involved. There's no JSON around. There's no serialization involved. There's no curly braces involved. I'm really confirming the controller's intent to return these JSON dinners, right? I'm confident that the ASP.NET Framework will serialize it itself, and that'll be an integration test later. Let's go over here in search controllers, though, and put something in there. I've got a JSON dinner, and I made this little method here, JSON dinner from dinner, because I didn't really feel like it was the right thing to do to take my dinner object from link to SQL and serialize it as JSON, because it didn't feel right. So this is really what they call a view model situation, where there's the model, dinners, and then there's what the view needs to know about dinners, the view model, view-specific model. So I just made a little thing here that's going to say, you give me a dinner, I'll give you a JSON dinner. And JSON dinners are a little bit simpler than regular dinners. Okay, and let's go and make our... somebody's having fun back there. They're either trying to get in or trying to get out. So I know it's moving slow, but I don't think it's that bad. I love this. You ever do the nullables? Int? I always think that in my head when I type that. Could be an int. Now here it says, not all code paths return a value. Let's do this by default. Let's return null. Now this is a really important aspect of test-driven development. I need to run this test, and I need to see it fail. I need to know that it can fail. And if I'm really,